For you Washington fans who were not around in 1991, well, this is your time to get excited. And for those of you that did enjoy that national championship at 12-0, hey, it has been over 30 years. So time to celebrate, time to, of course, enjoy the win against Texas. But one more step for the Huskies as they take on Michigan coming up on Monday night. We got Lars Hansen here from Locked On Huskies podcast. We always appreciate Lars stopping by to break down some Washington football. Lars, how you doing?
Good, Mark. Yeah, I was not around in 91, as you probably could guess. But I've known well about it and know what this means. And I've also seen the program at 0-12. So this is certainly, I think, nothing to be taken lightly for Washington fans. And they've shown it. So I think everybody has gotten behind Washington in this city and around the program.
We had you on a few times to talk some Texas, and the game pretty much laid out the way we anticipated in regards to not some just ridiculous, unbridled, just scoring fest in the 50s, but an offensive shootout in which Michael Pennock and those receivers delivered.
Yeah, and I mean, the ironic part is that I know you're going to, I don't know if you'll bring this up, but I'll bring it up now. When you asked me about my confidence level, and I said it was 80. The reason why I said that was because Washington never trailed in the game, right? It was going to be a good game. It was going to be an offensive test, a test for the defense, especially late. But they pretty much answered the bell if you're Washington. And honestly, if we're being real, Texas should not have been in any position to be in that game in the fourth quarter. And the final 6 minutes, I'll just be friendly, because there was you're talking about the first half with Jeremy Bernard's botched fumble that leads to a Texas touchdown. You're talking about Washington going for it early and not getting it, one, and then two, now having to do it again in the fourth quarter just to get a field goal. You get a turnover against Texas that only leads to a field goal. That to be fair, was Washington probably at about 80%, just in terms of execution, quality, and things like that, because I can't recall. I mean, I know they had one or two special teams issues throughout the season, but I don't recall ever it seeming that bad that ended up also that bad, right? Where you fumble the ball and the team scores, right? And in the biggest stage, you can't have that.
Would have been one of the great debacles in the history of college football had Texas been able to pull that off. And they had several shots. It wasn't as though, hey, there was this timing situation and game management situation that has led Texas to inexplicably have a shot at a Hail Mary from the 50-yard line. No, they had 4 or 5 legitimate shots from inside the 15-yard line.
Yeah, and you know what's crazy about that, and this will lead into our eventual conversation about Michigan, but Texas in the game did not pass as well as they ran the ball. Now, yes, Quinn Ewers was good, right? He certainly, to that Bama fan, was not the best quarterback in the game, let alone the playoffs. But on our previous show, when that Alabama fan said that Ewers was the best one, or at least it was on one of your shows, some Alabama fan said that. And I remember that sticking in my head. I'm like, I like Quinn's nice. Don't get me wrong. I love South Lake Carroll. I love the Dragons. Love all that. He was not better than Michael Pennock in that game. Granted, nobody could have been, because Michael Pennock was on point. But I was surprised, and I know they didn't, the timeout situation and all that, but I think there was more of a chance for Texas running the ball and gashing Washington to get a touchdown on that drive than there was for Quinn Ewers to have 4 passes and get a touchdown. Because to me, he had only gotten a touchdown once in the game, and that was earlier in the fourth quarter. Ironically, and I'm doing the story on Elijah Jackson because we got to talk to the Washington players on Thursday, where the touchdown pass that he threw to Mitchell earlier in the fourth quarter was the same ball he should have thrown to Mitchell on the final play that probably could have won him the game. If that ball is thrown any better, Elijah Jackson does not have as much of a chance to go get that ball. It was the probably worst thrown ball of the fourth quarter by Quinn Ewers, and it happened on the worst play for Texas.
Yeah, so you bring up a couple situations there that I've got to kind of question, but far be it for me to take 2 of the best play callers in the country to task here. Yeah. But you do mention the 4th and 1 earlier in the game in which Washington was down around the 10-yard line. I thought it was a peculiar call to go. This wasn't 4th and a half a yard. This was a 4th and a full 2, and they just thought Dylan Johnson was the guy just to slam it up in there and get the first down.
Yeah, and they saw the same play on 3rd and 1. It was 2 back-to-back run plays. It wasn't like, okay, you try and get Pennock to pass on a play action, and okay, Texas is good on the pass, so maybe we should try and run it. And then also you kind of bunched everybody up there to where there was no open lane for Johnson to run through. Now, granted, you got to give credit to Texas, right, for pushing the line and not getting blown off the ball there. But yeah, especially early in the game, just take the points. Kalen DeBoer has said that numerous times this year in certain games where, we just felt like against Oregon in the first game where they took those points every single time. Had they done that against Oregon and not gotten it, that October game could have been different. So it was a little bizarre to see them chase the game so early because they didn't need to chase. They just take the points. Grady Gross hit all of his field goals against Texas in the Sugar Bowl. So it wasn't like you have a questionable place kicker who has missed half the kicks he's had this season. That's understandable, right? I understand, that maybe this is at the, and to your point, if this is at the 45, right? If you want to just get a little closer and then you get 3rd and 1 when you're at the 25 or the 15, then you kick the field goal. No, this was just completely bizarre. But as I said to you on our pre-show, if Ryan Grubb doesn't beat Ryan Grubb, Washington wins this game. But he tried his best to beat himself a couple of times in this game.
Staying with the Washington offense, but shift this conversation toward Michigan. So Michael Pennock is probably the best quarterback in the country. I think entering the playoff that there was a great debate throughout the season. Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, Pennock, Caleb Williams obviously didn't have the season he did last year, but he's in the conversation. What I saw in this playoff was the best quarterback in the country. Couple conditions on it was, number one, he generally had all sorts of time to throw. So we talked about Texas being stout up front in the middle, but maybe not the edge rushers with the waves of edge rushers needed that Michigan may bring. And then also Pennock is so good that even though he played about as well as he can play, it wasn't, in my view, a guy that's playing out of his mind that's never going to play like that again. He's capable of replicating that performance.
Without question, yeah. And I think that was kind of the thing for coming into that game where we all heard about Trevonde Sweat and Byron Murphy. Byron Murphy's the only pass rusher of those two. Trevonde Sweat is a run stuffer. Against Washington, that doesn't matter because Dylan Johnson doesn't have to run he's not Blake Corum, right? Washington's offense is not predicated upon Dylan Johnson running the ball. So with Texas not having that pass rush, yeah, the problem now to Michigan is you got Mason Graham. You got all these defenders that actually can and have gotten to the quarterback. The one thing that I do think is a caveat to your point also, I don't think Michigan has faced a pass blocking offensive line like Washington's. They are nowhere near as good in the run. I hand up give you that one every single time. But I'm not sure there's a better pass blocking offensive line in the country. So I'm curious to see how good actually is that Michigan defense, right? How good is that Michigan front seven? Can Mason Graham beat Troy Furtado and Roger Rosengarten multiple times in the game like he did against Alabama? But Alabama and Jalen Milroe are not Michael Pennock in Washington, right? Again, it's crazy to say, right? Because you think Alabama, you think, oh, no matter what, they're always going to have the better players. And I don't know that that's the case this year, right? So now for Washington, Troy Furtado is going to be a top 50 pick, maybe even a first rounder. Roger Rosengarten, a right tackle, arguably could come back and work himself into that first round category, but no question he's a top 60 pick, right? So with that being said, can those guys do it one more time? Because Pennock has proven, what does he need? 3 seconds, 3, maybe 4 seconds. And he can kind of create that last second if he wants to by his pocket awareness. And Michigan's secondary isn't to me as bad as Texas's, but I don't think it's as good as their front seven. So I think there's chances to be had. And at the end of the day, that over the middle is usually where Pennock eats anyways.
I'll counter that in regards to the last statement that you made, Lars, in that I don't know that anyone in the nation can bring the third and fourth corners to the table with confidence. So taking the first two guys, Will Johnson and Mike Sanderstill, they're about as good as it gets. So we know the way football's structured, especially in today's game, that it's so tilted toward the offense and the receivers that you have to have great corners to cover good receivers. You have to have good corners to cover marginal receivers. It's just so slanted toward the receivers. Now we've got a matchup of great receivers, great corners. So of course they're going to be mismatched most of the time, but at least with that level of coverage from your top two guys, if you're Michigan, there are going to be plays that they're going to be able to hang with those guys, and they don't need that pass rush every play.
And I agree, right? So I think this is probably the best defense Washington will have faced this season because the only other one would have been Oregon, right? I mean, I don't think Utah's defense is anywhere near close to Michigan in this game. So the one that it would be Oregon. And Oregon's secondary is probably not as good as Michigan's. I think that's a fair point. I think Will Johnson versus Rome Odunze is going to be an interesting matchup because that one, to me, you're talking about two NFL guys going at it for, I'm going to say what, probably 40 plays, 30 plays, because I would have to imagine those two. And this is where this chess game in college football between offensive coaches and defensive coaches happens, right? Where how do we get Will Johnson lined up against maybe Jalen McMillan or Jalen Polk, right? To where we can kind of try and scheme around and get rid of Rome Odunze or Jalen Polk or Jalen McMillan and make it so that it's not always just Rome versus Will, right? Because I think certain times Washington's going to want to use Rome Odunze as a decoy. So you want to make sure you're still having your best defenders on who truly Washington wants to have on that play, to your point, where the pass rush doesn't have to be a factor every single play.
Got Lars Hansen breaking down Washington football. Of course, the Huskies and the Wolverines get together for the national championship Monday in Houston. And Dylan Johnson, do we have any hope that he's going to be serviceable in this game?
Yeah, Dylan Johnson's probably going to start the game for Washington. Yeah. I would be now. How many snaps does he get? I would still say it's probably north of 15. Dylan Johnson, I'm just going to characterize it this way, has been playing on one foot for the last month. Now it gotten a little healthier against Texas, but then you saw that he re-aggravated the same injury that he had. But Dylan Johnson has proven both at Mississippi State and Washington he can play through pretty much any pain. And so I think if Dylan Johnson can even just give you 60, 70 yards, doesn't have to be great, doesn't have to be all worldly. But if Dylan Johnson can just help Michael Pennock balance out the offense, that's all he really needs to do. So I certainly think Dylan Johnson's going to be a go in this game.
So from the games I've seen Washington, and obviously I've seen the last two start to finish, you've got Will Dixon in regards to a statistical role as being the number 2 guy, but Tybo Rogers came in. He had a 17-yard run against Texas. He carried the ball 5 times. So how do you expect that supplemental back to play out?
Yeah, Tybo Rogers, a true freshman out of Bakersfield, has basically been Washington's second running back this season in terms of production. Will Nixon, a transfer from Nebraska, came in prior to last season, has been good, but the coaches don't like him as much in run blocking, and he's not as good of a runner as I think Dylan Johnson or maybe even Tybo Rogers is, right? Will Johnson's kind of a scat back, more of a receiver than a running back, but he's played running back, kind of a good pass catcher, if you will. But that hasn't really been what Washington's wanted to do this season with their running backs. So Dylan Johnson's pass blocking ability has been kind of what separated him above everybody else in terms of why he's continued to get even more carries than you would think the backups would. But Will Nixon, to me, is a guy, he'll get 5 snaps, but he just hasn't really seemed like he's going to do much with it this season. Tybo has been the guy where it's almost interesting where when they go to Tybo Rogers, they're giving him 3 or 4 plays in a row, and it's at a random point in the game. We saw it against Texas where he had a 17-yard run, and I believe he had 1 or 2 more for like maybe 10 yards total. So Tybo hasn't been consistent, but he's kind of been that explosive back when they've needed him to be. He's certainly still a freshman in every stretch of the imagination. He's got a lot of room to grow. That's where Richard Newton, or a senior, who's basically kind of been not cast aside. He's had some injury struggles throughout his career, but he's their second best pass blocking running back right now. So that's why he's also going to get in the game. Sam Adams has been hurt over the last month, so he probably won't be in the game. But he, again, kind of in that Will Nixon mold, hasn't necessarily been what Washington's needed from the running back position. So Tybo is an interesting kid because he's certainly not a capable run blocker, but he's shown this season he's willing to take a punch. And so I think that's really all you need him to do when he spells Dylan Johnson is just not cost Washington a sack. I think that's the kind of the floor for Tybo Rogers. And most of that, usually they don't even put him in that situation because if they're bringing Tybo in, they're going to run the ball. They've thrown to him a couple of times, but it's almost been just designed runs for him.
Lars, as soon as you mentioned Newton's name and Adams' name, I thought, I know those names. I know those guys. I haven't heard those names in forever. So my recollection of Newton was he was a pretty serviceable back that got some time a couple of years ago. Wasn't Adams a big recruit?
Yeah, the son of Sam Adams played in the NFL, I believe, for the Baltimore Ravens. Yeah, he was a big 4-star running back out of Eastside Catholic, and I believe the 2020 class. It was the 2020 class. Coincidentally, he was their second running back taken in that class. They liked Javion Sunday, a running back out of Waco, Texas, who injured Cam Davis going into the Alamo Bowl. in an unfortunate practice injury, if you will. And so having Sam Adams kind of on the roster, he's been there, but he just hasn't been able to stay healthy throughout his entire career. And that's also noting the fact that during those first couple of years, he wasn't even relied upon to carry the ball more than 5 times a game because you had other backs, Richard Newton, others, plenty others, Cam Davis ahead of him. And Sam just, for whatever reason, hasn't been able to stay healthy. Coincidentally, we've actually never talked to him from a media perspective, just never had the opportunity. So yeah, he kind of came in with a lot of fanfare as a 4-star, but certainly hasn't lived up to the billing. And that's not a slight at Sam. That's just a fact of the matter. And so he's gotten a few carries almost at weird times, kind of like Tybo this season. But once he got hurt again, I believe late November, early December, it kind of put the wrap on him for the rest of the season.
Got Lars Hansen here breaking down Washington football. Of course, the Huskies and the Wolverines for the National Championship 2023. You can catch Lars' work, Locked On Huskies podcast. It's also the UW Fan Nation network as well. Folks, you stop by and have a great time listening to the conversation and the breakdown, but support here at the Voice of College Football, support Lars and what he does there at Locked On Huskies podcast. When do you expect the next podcast to drop?
So I think we're going to do one tomorrow on Saturday, kind of a live. Most of them we do Monday through Friday or pre-recorded, just for pulling back the curtain a little bit here. But most of our listeners know that by now, at least I would hope. But we do some live shows, and particularly as you would kind of imagine, Sugar Bowl, National Championship, we're going to have a few live shows just to kind of create some extra attention to the game. But then our next pre-recorded show, which we're going to do the offensive breakdown, defensive breakdown, the big preview show will be Monday morning. That comes out around 7 or 8 in the morning every day.
Folks, please like the video here. And again, you can see Lars' information there on the banner. You can follow him right on Twitter/X and follow him to all of his platforms. All right, let's talk Michigan offense, Washington defense. And we know what the Wolverines want to do. If they knew they could just run the ball 50 or 60 times and not have to throw it, that's probably what they do. They're known for running the football. Blake Corum's got 25 rushing touchdowns. However, 5.9 yards per carry last year, 4.7 this year. And if you watch the games from week to week, which I see almost all of Michigan's games, it's been noticeable. The offensive line has not been nearly as dominant. Of course, they have handed the Joe Moore Award for after 2 years to Washington and just had issues up front with run blocking. However, if you look at primarily, credit the Iowa defense. Michigan could not do anything against them, period, especially on the ground, like 1.6 yards per carry. Now, against Ohio State and Penn State, couldn't run the ball, running into a brick wall for 3 quarters. Then they started to lean and it started to crack, and they finally started to make some ground up in the 4th quarter. The one knock I will have, Lars, on Texas would be, for as good as Sark is at play calling, I think some of those guys are kind of like mad scientists. And when it becomes too basic, they get bored. They probably should have stayed with Jadon Blue and with CJ Baxter.
Yeah, and again, that was the same thing I said about the Alamo Bowl last year. Was Sark for some reason wanted to turn it into, hey, I'm a passing guy, I'm a this and that. I'm gonna prove that I have the better quarterback, and yeah, especially against Michael Pennock, that was probably the dumbest decision. And I love Sark. Right? I've said that before. I admire the guy, all that. He's a great play caller, but he basically kind of handed that game to Washington by choosing to not run the ball as much. In this game, I have no doubt Sherrone Moore is going to know Washington's weaknesses run defense. No matter how average or whatever you want to say about Michigan's run blocking, I think they're probably better than Washington's defensive line in terms of a run stopping perspective. That said, they're not going to be able to run the ball every play. Can JJ McCarthy and that offensive line hold up against Braylon Trice? Because Braylon Trice is a man on a mission. I think pretty clear the country can see that now. And the one thing that I looked at with JJ McCarthy is he's only thrown for more than 300 yards once in the season. Now, again, yards aren't everything and all that, but that tells me Michigan can be had if Washington doesn't get completely destroyed up front in the run game. So I think if Washington's able, when JJ McCarthy does pass ball, that's when you're going to have to set Michigan into those 2nd and 10s, 3rd and 10s, 3rd and 8s. You have to put Michigan in down and distance, because if Blake Corum is doing 3 yards or 4 yards in a cloud of dust, JJ McCarthy just has to get 5 yards, and that's easy on 3rd and 2, right? Or again, seemingly easy. We saw Texas not get it from the 13-yard line 4 times. So it's never easy, right? But certainly in that situation, you probably take JJ McCarthy in that 3rd and 2 situation more than you would if I ask you, JJ McCarthy has to throw the ball on 3rd and 10 or 3rd and 8 7 or more times in this game. Is that as confident versus if he only has to throw it maybe once or twice because Michigan's getting it done on the run game? That's what's going to be the key for Michigan if they want to put away Washington, because Washington's going to hang with them for 4 quarters. I'll just tell you that right now.
Washington rush defense, number 43 in the country, seems pretty respectable, right? But they're 86th in yards per play against. Yards per carry, Oregon tore them up both games pretty well. Now, the second game, I'm assuming that Oregon only ran it a certain number of times because obviously they got down by 3 scores in that game. USC had a field day at 7.5 yards per carry. But you know better than anyone, the Washington defense is probably healthier right now than it's been in some of those matchups.
Yeah, without question. And I mean, and to your point, in that second game against Oregon, Bucky Irving and Jordan James only combined for, I believe, 60 yards. So Bo Nix got the rest of that. And again, that's more of a credit to Bo Nix and him having to scramble and kind of make things happen. So that gives you promise, right? If you're Washington, but then you saw against Texas, Jaden Blue and CJ Baxter kind of had their way when they were called upon. Again, questions why they weren't called upon even more. But if Blake Corum is carrying the ball 30 times in this game, as much as I can respect Blake Corum's ability, I'm not so sure every single one of those or even half of them would be significant gashes. So I think it's a matter of, okay, can Blake Corum, I think you almost hit the nail on the head. If Washington starts ahead and Michigan has to chase this game, that's going to be harder for Blake Corum and Michigan to control the clock. And in a way, control the clock, but also match Washington stride for stride, because that's when you get into, okay, JJ McCarthy now has to be a passer. Roman Wilson and the receivers have to make plays. This isn't just the Blake Corum show. So I think Washington certainly is healthier up front. They're certainly healthier in the back end with Cam Perviculon and Asa Turner. The front seven, for the most part, has basically been what it's been the entire back half of the season, where, I mean, Tulu Tuilagasnoa, Fatu Tuitele, MJLA, those guys have basically been healthy for most of the back half of the season. Again, nobody's healthy at this point of the year, but their performance against Oregon and also to a degree against Texas gives me hope that they can at least do enough to slow down Blake Corum, and that won't be the reason why they lose this game.
I'm going to break a few little narratives here and see what your response is. So while Michigan isn't known for throwing the ball, and as you mentioned, J.J. McCarthy only 300 yards once this year. I think that was against Michigan State, where for whatever reason Michigan just chose to just completely annihilate them. Didn't need to throw it, but just wanted to, and won 49-0. But Michigan is number 5 in the country in pass efficiency. So they're very efficient, 24 touchdowns, 5 picks. JJ inexplicably threw 3 against Bowling Green. So they must be his kryptonite. But this surprised me as well. So that's on the Michigan positive side from a passing perspective. That's not necessarily given credit to them. But on the defensive side against the pass, in a passing league that is probably the best in the nation, Washington, number 32 in pass efficiency defense with 16 interceptions as well. And they're facing Oregon, who's number 2 in pass efficiency twice. They're facing USC, who's number 3. Arizona's number 10. So they faced 4 of the top 10 pass efficiency offenses and still held up statistically pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been pretty, but it's more so timely, right? Against Utah, Dominique Hampton seals the game. Alfonso Chupatala has a near pick 6 and then decides to drop the president at the 2-yard line. Utah recovers, wastes a touchdown opportunity there for Washington. So the defense has certainly been better, I think, than even what I would have given them credit for. I will say there was more so in the first, I want to say, 7 games of the season. I don't think it was anywhere near what it is now. But that, again, to your point, Cameron Fabiculon has really been kind of the unsung hero of the secondary of the season, because when he's been out, those, McEllisteen has been serviceable. Dominique Hampton's been good, but he needs that second guy next to him kind of directing the defense. Asa Turner is probably the quarterback of the secondary, but he's been hurt for a majority of the season. Now that he's back, he made a fumble against Texas in the second half there that changed the tides as well. So it's more so been timely, because no matter what, we saw it against USC where offenses and good offenses are going to get their yards and get their points. But Washington, when called upon, when dire necessary, will make the plays on defense. And we saw that ultimately in the fourth quarter against Texas, where Elijah Jackson, as I said, allows the touchdown to A.D. Mitchell earlier in the quarter and then comes back. And also on that final drive, got beat by Xavier Worthy. So in terms of a mentality, I think that's where Washington's underrated defensively, because these guys have been tried and tested every single day. And by the way, having to go against this offense in practice, if you're a defensive back, it doesn't matter what opposing offense you face, you know how good you can play. So I think that also has helped them. And I think the last few games of the season, again, holding Oregon, holding Texas, a pretty good passing offense, has given them confidence that, again, J.J. McCarthy is certainly going to make his plays, but I think it's not a sure and bet that Washington's secondary is just going to get routed every single time.
Yeah, I think McCarthy needs to be a running threat, or at least show that. He doesn't have to do it like 15 times, but I think he needs to show that, like he did against Alabama. He had 2 very key runs in that game. If we take out, Lars, Braylon Trice and anyone else you expect to be kind of a given on the defensive side, and then Pennock and the receivers is a given. If Michael Pennock goes out there and goes 16 for 37, well, the game's over. They lost. He played the worst game of his season. But if we consider those guys givens, who are some of the key guys on either side of the ball that you consider, okay, X factors? If they come through, then things are really looking good for Washington.
Yeah, I would say the other, and this is kind of cheating a little bit, but the other guy opposite of Braylon Trice, Zion Tupuola-Fatui, has been that guy where he hasn't, I don't think, had the production anybody thought he would have, or even that he thought he would have. But again, it comes down to timely plays. When he forced the fumble on Caleb Williams against USC, there's been time and time again this season where when Washington, and that's kind of why he's an X factor, right? Him and Cameron Fabiculano would be my 2 X factors, one in the front and one in the back. Asa Turner and Cam Fab, probably kind of a hybrid, give half a credit to each for being an X factor. Because again, if JJ McCarthy runs, it's going to be that secondary not getting gashed for a big run, right? Or Blake, and even when Blake Corum, if he's able to get through the front 7 and the linebackers, it's got to be on Cam Fabiculano and Asa Turner and whoever else is back there, honestly, but I think it's going to be mostly those 2, Dom Hampton probably as well, to make those stops and not turn a 20-yard run into a 60, 80-yard touchdown, because Blake Corum has that ability. And so Zion Tupuola-Fatui has to get pressure in this game. I believe he only got 1 pressure against Texas. He's been a guy that, I mean, again, it's hard to criticize him, not just because, so he lost his dad right before the USC, or I believe, I don't know if it was the week before the USC game. So I believe, I can't remember what game it was, but his father passed during the game, and Elijah and Zion didn't know about it until after the game. And he has played through that the entire season. But in a way, that tragedy has basically fueled him. And I think in a national championship game, when everyone has to play at their best, he's a guy that has shown he can explode. And this is his last chance to do it. So I think even if Braylon Trice doesn't have necessarily the game that we all think he will have, Zion Tupuola-Fatui is just going to be just as important on the other side of that line. And then, as I said, Cameron Fabiculano and Asa Turner, and even Dom Hampton in the secondary, those probably, I'm going to cheat. Those 3 in the secondary and Zion would be my X factors of people that are not typically known.
I'm going to throw one out on offense because I wasn't too familiar with this guy until about a month ago, and that's Devin Culp, the tight end. He's a lot to try to handle.
Yeah, so here's a funny story about him. He was originally, I believe, committed to Oregon under Willie Taggart, backed off that commitment relatively early on in the process, maybe midway through the process. He was a running back for Spokane Prep. Had not really played tight end, and when Jordan Powerhouse signed, the tight ends coach back in the day, signed him to Washington, he took him as, okay, this guy is a great athlete. He can make the plays. He's tough. But in his career, he struggled with drops. And then this season, it's been a completely different Devin Culp. I mean, from a pass blocking perspective, even in run blocking, he's been better. But he's truly showed out in catching the ball. He's made some really tough catches. And so he almost, kind of like that Quentin Moore play where nobody would have thought that they're going to him on a touchdown play in the Pac-12 championship game. Devin Culp has been also equally that guy to where when when Jalen McMillan's covered, when Roma Junze is covered, when Jalen Polk is covered, Devin Culp's that fourth option right there. And him and Jack Westover have kind of been those two security blankets. Obviously, Westover is the starter, a little more well-known as the pass catcher. But Devin Culp, really, I'm so proud of him because he really struggled with drops. Like he was the kind of guy that would drop it with nobody around him and then make the tough catch. And now he's making both of them on a consistent basis. Now, they're not targeting him a lot because, again, in this offense, the tight ends are kind of the sixth offensive lineman / second running back, if you will, right? Where we're not going to call upon you, but you're just as important, right? We need you to block, we need you to kind of do your job, but you're probably not going to get anywhere near the targets that the receivers are going to get. And to the guys' credit, they're just as important in this offense as the receivers, even though it doesn't seem like it, because it's, again, when you need that touchdown play, they're always there. Devin Culp's catch against USC when Michael Pennock rolled out and caught it near the sideline, that was without question his best play of his career, but kind of just symbolizes this season's version of Devin Culp, which 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even maybe last year, Devin Culp's not making that catch.
And I don't think this is going to be a major factor, but we're used to good weather or indoor conditions for Super Bowls and national championship games. Now, Michigan wouldn't mind if this game was played, somewhere else, but again, I don't think it's going to be a major factor, but this is exactly what Washington wants is, of course, no wind, no nothing, just 72 degrees, and let's go. We're on the carpet.
Yep. What is it? The NFL track meet, if you will, right? Where it's a track, and that it sets up. That's why this game sets up so perfectly for Washington. And to peel back the curtain for everybody else, the only reason this game scares me is because of Blake Corum. Like, Washington hasn't faced a running back like Blake Corum this season, even Bucky Irving, right? So if Washington's offense, and that's kind of the interesting thing about this matchup, is you're getting an offense that is predicated upon running the ball but passing efficiently, so you can kind of slow the clock down, and an offense that can score in 2 plays. And, 2 pass plays, boom, you're there. I mean, Jalen Polk's 77-yarder, I think there's 7 or 8 plays of 20+ yards in Sugar Bowl or something like that. So it tells me that if Washington can just get ahead by 10 points, right? If there's a 10-point cushion, right? Even if that's 20-10, right? That's enough of a separator to where Michigan now has to chase the game. And that, I think, and somebody said this earlier in the week, Michigan's best receiver would be the 4th receiver for Washington, maybe the 5th. And that's not a fight to Roman Wilson, because Roman Wilson is good.
Yeah.
But would you take at their full health Polk, McMillan, and Odunze over Roman Wilson? If you don't, I would assume you're a Michigan fan. And again, he's a solid player, so it's not a slight to Roman Wilson. But when you have 3 NFL receivers, and to your point, going against, let's just say, 2 quarterbacks that could play in the NFL, it's that second, that third, that fourth, that 5th read that's going to decide this game for Washington on offense, at least.
I've heard it said that, so I'm not going to take credit for this, that Michigan is uniquely prepared for this situation and this offense because they turned the program around chasing Ohio State. That Ohio State owned the Big Ten and had Justin Fields and an array of great wide receivers and then CJ Stroud. And so Michigan had to build toward slaying the giant, and now they're facing this version of CJ Stroud and Jackson Smith and Jake Budd, Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, and I think, here's the interesting thing about that, because if you ask Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer, they're not Ohio State. Their offenses, while they look similar and they have similar concepts, and we're talking NFL quarterbacks, 3 NFL receivers, but the way they execute their offense is slightly different than Ohio State's. That's just from what the coaches would tell you. I would think maybe Buffalo Bills would be more of a comp for Washington's offense and just that kind of general style. But to your point, I think that as good as CJ Stroud was, he was a better runner than Penix. I'm not sure he was a better passer. Again, still a great passer. So this is not a slight to CJ Stroud. But I do think it is kind of an interesting matchup in that regard, because Michigan, to your point, has been able to beat Ohio State at least 2 years in a row or 3 years in a row.
3.
I know 3. That's what I thought. So I knew it's the last 2 for sure, but now 3 in a row. But I'm still not certain that. I mean, man, it's hard, right? Because that it's a good example, and I totally see the comparison. I just think this Washington offense, with the way Ryan Grubb schemes the offense and the design of the plays, is different, but with the same skill set of players, if that makes sense, right? So I think Michigan has gotten used to the bodies and the style, but the play calling is not what Ohio State's is. And I think, and again, as great as Ryan Day is, and he inherited a kingdom from Urban Meyer and kind of not drove it into the ground, but in Ohio
It
State's
did
right,
go 11-1 this year.
right, but it just seems like, and again, this is a West Coast guy, but it just seems like Ohio State fans, again, the mark is so high up that anything less than that, it seems like it's driving into the ground, right? You lost 3 straight to Michigan. Ryan Day has torpedoed the program. Well, no, they're still like one of the top 10 teams in the country. So what exactly are we saying here? So I do think it's an interesting matchup in that regard, but I am more intrigued by the play calling than I am the players, because to your point, Michigan can match up against their players, but if they're schemed differently, then that could be where Washington has success. Again, Michigan, to your point, this is the best matchup for them, right? I think this is exactly who Michigan would have wanted. And again, they're the number 1 team in the country, so it doesn't matter. But for Washington, it's going to be, how can you create those openings? And Ryan Grubb is probably one of the 2 or 3 best in the country at doing that. Against Alabama, Michigan had Tommy Rees. Tommy Rees is not Ryan Grubb. There's a reason why Ryan Grubb was wanted by Nick Saban and he had to settle for Tommy Rees. So this game, I think, it's going to be an interesting chess match, because there's the pass rush, there's the secondary, there's the familiarity with the style of play. But Washington's been that. And again, this is where I don't lose the credibility, but where it almost just seems kind of so hard to be like, but Washington has always played coast games really well this season. Michigan's had a couple, right? But Michigan in a 4-quarter test, I can still see them winning, but it certainly won't be by more than a possession. And when I say a possession, like 7 points or more.
Lars, one last thing. I just find this amusing for whatever reason. We talked last week going into the Texas game, and I believe it's when we had Matthew Miller on here as well, that these 2 teams played in an Alamo Bowl. And who would have guessed that the next season they're playing in a semifinal game? That was a far less stretch, because Washington was a top 10 team and Texas certainly had the talent to make that run. And a lot of us did project that they would take off this year. But to project 2 years ago that the Michigan-Washington game in 2021 was going to turn into a national championship game, now that's a stretch.
Yeah, I don't we mentioned this on our podcast a couple of times this week, where Blake Corum had that 67-yard touchdown run in the 3rd quarter, but Washington actually was kind of in that game. Now, again, first of all, 2 different teams, right? Last year it would be less of a stretch, still a stretch, but not as much, right? Because you had Jackson Kirkland, Henry Bainavalu. That offensive line was the one that faced Michigan in that 2021 matchup in Ann Arbor. But Blake Corum is really the only consistent one from that. And yeah, it's also ironic that now after this game, Michigan has to travel to Washington next year in October to face the Huskies. So again, it will be a non-Michael Pennock offense. It will be a Will Rogers offense. So it will still be prolific in some regard. But it's an interesting matchup, because this team that Michigan plays in the national championship will be much different than the one that plays next year at Husky Stadium. But there's going to be some overlap. There will be much like Blake Corum, right? There will be a handful of players that will be there from that game. But yeah, it's an interesting notion, because let's be real here. That 21 Lake team was nowhere near this 22, 23, whatever which, as I've said on your show before, this roster, the nucleus of that team was on 21. Asa Turner was still there. All the receivers were there. However, the ironic part about that game, I believe all 3 receivers were hurt. So Michigan has never faced these 3 receivers ever. So that
makes sense, because I looked at the box score and I didn't see anybody but Culp catching passes in that game.
And I believe Taj Davis had 1, maybe 2, but yeah, that was Dylan Morris did not deserve what he got from a coaching perspective, because the kid, he's now in the transfer portal. He's going to spend his grad transfer year elsewhere and then likely come back as a GA a couple years down the road under Kalen DeBoer. But Dylan Morris is better than what that team showed. I could only imagine if Kalen DeBoer was coaching that game, how much different it would. Michigan probably still wins that game, but it's by nowhere near how it looked. I mean, we talked about the offensive line. I remember watching that play, the game back at the airport, 5-6 hours later, and just seeing the offensive line. I'm like, literally, Michigan has 3 defenders and a linebacker in the backfield within 2 seconds, and there's 3 offensive linemen for Washington not even blocking anybody. So that's what told me right away, okay, there was no coaching on this offensive staff. That is not a shot at Scott Huff, who was the only holdover, because Scott Huff also got dragged, and look what happened 2 years later. He's now a Joe Moore award-winning offensive line coach. He recruited all these guys to the program. So he's the one that can, of anybody that can take credit for this. And so I think it'll be an interesting matchup to see how much similar with the, not similar because the game obviously was a rout for Michigan, but kind of how much can that run game, because Michigan is still going to be predicated upon the run. I still think at the end of the day, McCarthy will get his throws and all that, but if Blake Corum and Michigan win, it's because there's probably 120 yards, or not even 120. I'll say 110 and at least 2 touchdowns on the ground for Michigan. If Washington can hold Blake Corum to 1 touchdown and maybe 70, 80 yards, 90 yards, which he's done this season, right? He hasn't run for 100 yards every single game. But if they're able to control the line and force JJ McCarthy to pass more, and especially in down and distance, that's going to be how Washington wins this game. Because if they're in 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, 3rd and 1 for the majority of the game, Michigan's winning this game. And it'll be close, but it won't be as close as the score indicates at the end.
Corum was in that like 2-yard per carry range against Ohio State until very late in the game. And then he broke free and still only about 4 yards per carry. Michigan held him. He was in the 3 yards per carry until that final overtime touchdown run. So those padded the stats for sure.
Yep.
All right, Lars. Great breakdown as always. Always love having you here. Everybody go support Lars, not because it helps him, but because it helps you in understanding this game better. So check out all of Lars' work there. You see it all posted on the banner right there. Locked On Huskies podcast, UW Fan Nation as well. Lars, appreciate it. Enjoy the game.
Oh, I'll let you know how much I enjoy it after Monday night.